My name is Elena Winters, and I was 22 years old when my grandmother was buried under a sky so painfully blue it felt cruel. I didn't cry at the funeral, not because I didn't love her, and certainly not because I wasn't shattered inside, but because grief hit me like a delayed wave, something I knew would knock me flat later when no one was watching. I stood there in a black dress that didn't quite fit my shoulders, hands folded tight in front of me, listening to hymns echo off chapel walls. She'd loved for decades, feeling strangely hollow. Grandma Evelyn was the only person who had ever made me feel like I wasn't an inconvenience. Everyone else in my family tolerated me at best. After my mother died, when I was 10, I became something awkward. Extra luggage passed between relatives who never quite knew what to do with a quiet girl who didn't ask for much and expected even less. But Grandma Evelyn, she listened. Every week, without fail. Phone calls, handwritten letters, birthday cards, signed in careful cursive with the same line every time. Don't forget you're already enough. So when I tell you what happened after the funeral, understand, this was never just about money. It was about losing the one person who saw me and then watching people who never cared try to erase what she left me. The ranch was legendary in our family. 200 acres of rolling land, weathered barns, an orchard that bloomed stubbornly every spring, and a house that creaked like it was alive. Grandma had lived there her entire life. So had her father before her. To everyone else, it was property. To her, it was history. My uncle Richard Winters, Rick, as he liked to be called, always assumed it would be his someday. My Aunt Lorraine spoke about renovations as if they were inevitable. Their sons Tyler and Brandon treated the ranch like a future investment portfolio they hadn't bothered to earn yet. I stayed quiet. I always had. Growing up, Rick and Lorraine took me in temporarily, which somehow lasted years. I learned early how to be invisible. Family vacations I wasn't invited to. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Compliments framed like insults. You're so low maintenance, Elena. You never cause trouble. At 18, I left with a scholarship and never looked back. Except for Grandma. I came home for her, always for her. When she died, the family descended like vultures in black suits. The funeral was simple, the kind she wanted. Open casket, soft hymns. Rick gave the eulogy, and it sounded more like a business presentation than grief. He talked about land values, community impact, legacy, words polished to impress, not to honor. Afterward, we gathered at the ranch. The air felt heavy, unnaturally still. I wandered the orchard alone, fingers brushing bark I knew by heart, remembering how she used to hum while picking apples, how she'd rest her hand on my shoulder when I doubted myself. The will reading was scheduled for the next morning. Rick took charge, of course, coordinated everything, called the lawyer, set the time. That night I got a text from him. 900 a.m., sharp. Don't be late. Lawyers flying in. No, are you okay? No, she loved you. Just instructions. I arrived early anyway, sitting at the old dining table where Grandma and I had eaten peach cobbler just months before. One by one, the family filed in, too polished, too confident. Lorraine wore pearls like armor. Tyler and Brandon barely looked up from their phones. My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. The lawyer arrived at 9:03. Mr. Delaney, an older man with steady hands and a leather briefcase that looked heavier than it should. He pulled out 2 envelopes. One cream-colored, one sealed with red wax. Before he spoke, I felt it. Something was about to change, and I had no idea how violently. Mr. Delaney cleared his throat once everyone had settled the sound, cutting through the tense quiet like a blade. He adjusted his glasses, opened the cream-colored envelope first, and began reading in a measured, practiced voice. At first, everything sounded exactly as expected: jewelry allocated to Lorraine, modest trusts, set up for Tyler and Brandon, with conditions they'd almost certainly complain about later, small, sentimental items, distributed among distant relatives who barely remembered Grandma's birthday, but somehow remembered her assets perfectly. Rick leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, confidence practically radiating off him. Lorraine nodded along, as if this were a formality, her lips curved in a restrained, satisfied smile. I kept my eyes on the table, tracing the familiar scratches in the wood with my gaze, trying not to think about how many times Grandma and I had laughed right where I was sitting now. Then Delaney paused. The silence stretched just long enough to feel wrong, and he continued, his voice steady. but noticeably slower, the full ownership of the Winters Ranch, including all land, livestock, equipment structures, and the adjoining orchard appraised at approximately $2.8 million, is hereby granted to Elena Winters, my granddaughter, in full, without lien or condition. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The room went utterly still, as if someone had sucked all the air out at once. My ears rang. My heartbeat thudded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Rick let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a bark than amusement. What he said, that's not funny. Lorraine blinked rapidly, her smile freezing on her face. Tyler finally looked up from his phone. Brandon scoffed openly. That's got to be a mistake. But Delaney didn't look confused. He didn't hesitate. He kept reading listing parcel numbers, legal descriptions, transfer clauses. Every word landed like a hammer strike, driving the reality deeper into my chest, until breathing felt like work. Rick stood so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. That doesn't make any sense, he snapped. She's a kid. She doesn't know the first thing about running a ranch. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I wasn't even sure what I would say if I could. Delaney calmly set the first will aside and reached for the second envelope, the white one sealed with red wax. Mrs. Winters anticipated this reaction, he said, which is why she left a secondary letter. It was to be opened only after the primary will was read. Rick's laugh this time was tight, brittle. I'm sure it's just sentimental nonsense. She always liked to dramatize. Delaney didn't smile. He broke the wax seal cleanly and unfolded the letter. As he read silently, something shifted in his expression. His brow furrowed. His eyes flicked briefly to me, then to Rick, then back to the page. Color drained from his face. He folded the letter carefully and cleared his throat. Elena, I believe we need to speak privately. Rick slammed his palm on the table so hard the dishes rattled. No, if it concerns the family, we all hear it. Delaney looked at me. It's your decision. My voice, when it finally came, was quiet but steady. Read it. The air in the room changed instantly, like the moment before a storm breaks. Delaney unfolded the letter again and began reading aloud, his tone heavier now, each word deliberate. If this letter is being read aloud, it means Rick reacted exactly as I expected him to. Rick's jaw tightened visibly. And if he's already said Elena is too young or not ready, then that only confirms I made the right choice. Lorraine reached for Rick's arm, but he shook her off. Rick. The letter continued, You have always believed you were entitled to this land, not because you love it, but because you see dollar signs where I see history. You and Lorraine have tried to convince me to sell for years. You brought developers to my kitchen table. You had Tyler draft mock plans for a so-called sustainable resort, hoping I'd be fooled by buzzwords. Lorraine's lips pressed into a thin, furious line. You told me Elena was weak, that she wouldn't know what to do with this place, that she would ruin it. But what you never understood is that Elena doesn't need to change the ranch to make it worthwhile. She sees it as it is. She sees me. My throat tightened painfully. To my sweet girl Delaney, read his voice softening. I know this won't be easy. They will try to make you feel small, unworthy, and out of place. Do not believe them. You belong here more than anyone. You are the last person I trust to protect this land. Rick exploded out of his chair. This is insane. She was sick. She wasn't in her right mind. Without missing a beat, Delaney slid a notarized document across the table. Mrs. Winters underwent a full psychiatric evaluation 2 months before signing. She was deemed fully competent. Rick stared at the paper like it had personally betrayed him. I'll contest this, he said through clenched teeth. I swear to God this isn't over. Something inside me finally snapped into place. I stood, my hands trembling, but my voice clear. Why do you want something you never loved? Rick's eyes cut to me. Don't act like you knew her better than I did. You were a charity case. A broken little girl she felt sorry for. The words hit sharp and cruel, but they didn't break me, the way he expected. You only showed up when it benefited you, I said. She saw through you years ago. You were just too arrogant to notice. Delaney cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. The transfer will be processed within the week. You are free to contest, but I advise you to consider the strength of the documentation. No one spoke after that. Rick stormed out first. Lorraine followed, muttering about lawyers. Brandon deliberately knocked over a decorative bowl as he left the crash echoing through the house like punctuation. Tyler didn't even look at me. I stayed behind numb while Delaney packed up his briefcase. Before he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder. She believed in you, Elena. Don't let them make you forget that. As the door closed behind him, the ranch fell silent again. But this time the silence felt different. Heavier, and dangerous. The first night I slept in the ranch house, I barely slept at all. I lay in Grandma's bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow, uneven circles, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of a house that had never fully learned how to be quiet. The room smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, her scent the one she'd worn for as long as I could remember. For a moment, I let myself believe she might walk in, scold me gently for taking her side of the bed, then laugh and tell me to scoot over. But morning came instead. I woke up early, pulled on jeans and an old flannel, and made coffee using her dented percolator. The wind chimes on the porch sang softly as the sun rose over the fields, bathing the land in gold. Standing there, mug warming my hands, I almost felt steady, almost convinced that if I just stayed quiet, worked hard, and followed the rules, things would settle. Rick made sure I didn't have that illusion for long. On the third day, I was mucking out the barn when I heard tires crunching down the long gravel drive. Through the wooden slats, I saw a white SUV pull in spotless and out of place. Lorraine stepped out, first heels sinking into the dirt like the ground itself was rejecting her. She wore sunglasses perched on her head and a tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. I met her at the gate. Elena, she said, skipping any pretense of warmth. Let's be realistic for a moment. I crossed my arms. What do you want? She gestured vaguely toward the ranch. This is a lot for someone like you. Rick and I talked. We're willing to make you a very generous offer. I laughed once, short and humorless. You tried this with Grandma. Her smile tightened. We were trying to help her retire comfortably. She was already comfortable, I said. She was happy. Lorraine exhaled sharply, impatience creeping through her composure. You're young. You could walk away with 7 figures and start over somewhere better. A city, a career. You don't need to be tied to goats and broken fences. I'll learn, I said simply. She tilted her head, studying me, the way people do when they're deciding whether someone is worth the effort. If you hold on to this place, it's only going to cause problems. You mean problems for you? Her jaw clenched. Without another word, she turned and walked back to the SUV. As it pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Tyler in the passenger seat, flipping me off through the tinted window. That night, someone slashed my truck tires. I didn't have cameras yet, but I didn't need them. The message was clear. I filed a report anyway. The local sheriff, an old friend of Grandma's, came by, surveyed the damage, and sighed like he'd seen this kind of thing too many times. Keep your head up, he told me. This sort of thing tends to escalate before it settles. He was right. Over the next week, calls started going unanswered. The feed store apologized politely, but said they couldn't extend credit. The vet postponed a routine visit indefinitely. Even the tractor supplier suddenly claimed scheduling conflicts. One man finally slipped and admitted, "We've been told it's best to wait until the legal situation clears." Rick was poisoning the well. In a town this small, rumors spread faster than facts. At the diner, conversations hushed when I walked in. Some people avoided my eyes. Others looked at me with pity, like I was already losing. Then came the break-in. I returned from the hardware store one afternoon to find the front door wide open. My stomach dropped. Inside drawers were pulled-out cabinets rifled through. My laptop was gone. So were the legal documents Delaney had given me. The only thing untouched was the framed photo of me and Grandma on the mantel. I called Delaney immediately. He stayed calm, promised replacements, but the violation lingered long after the call ended. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with a flashlight and a baseball bat, listening to every snap of twigs, every rustle in the trees, feeling watched. 2 days later, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You can't win. Sell the ranch or we'll take it from you. No signature, no dramatics, just certainty. That was my breaking point. Until then, I'd been trying to play fair, believing that if I followed the law and honored Grandma's wishes quietly, things would resolve. But standing there with that letter shaking in my hands, I finally understood. This wasn't about the ranch. This was about erasing me. I called Delaney again. What happens if they don't stop? There was a pause on the line. Then we stopped being polite. That was the first time he mentioned the other documents, the ones Grandma had kept hidden. A backup plan. I told him to come immediately. Whatever she'd prepared next, I knew it was going to change everything. Mr. Delaney arrived just after sunrise the next morning, his dusty gray sedan rolling slowly up the drive, as if even it sensed the weight of what he was carrying. He looked more tired than the last time I'd seen him. Dark circles under his eyes, jaw set tight. But the moment he stepped inside the house, his posture sharpened. He placed a thick black folder on Grandma's kitchen table, The same table where she used to knead dough for apple pies every fall and rested his hand on it like it might move if he didn't. Your grandmother called this her insurance, he said quietly. Plan B. I sat across from him, my hands wrapped around a mug I'd long forgotten to drink from. She knew they'd do this. He nodded. She knew Rick. Delaney slid the folder toward me and opened it. Inside were neatly organized documents, copies of letters, notarized statements, property records I'd never seen before. Then he pulled out a small USB drive and placed it between us. She started recording conversations after she realized they were pressuring her, he said. Mostly discussions she had with Rick and Lorraine. I kept these sealed in escrow, legally protected, until such a time it became necessary. My stomach churned. Is it legal? Perfectly, he said. And admissible. I plugged the USB into my laptop with shaking hands. There was only one audio file. Winter's August. I clicked play. Rick's voice filled the room. Casual confidence stripped of the false warmth he'd always put on in public. It's simple. You convince her to sell. We move her into a condo in town. She doesn't need all this space anymore. Lorraine's voice followed softer but sharper. And if she refuses, Rick chuckled. Then we make it uncomfortable. Cut off help. Delay repairs. Winter will do the rest. My chest tightened as the conversation continued. Developers fake proposals, even plans to use their sons as emotional leverage. Talk of lying about me leaving town, about isolating Grandma until she gave in. I felt sick. Delaney stopped the recording before it ended. There's more, he said, but this is enough. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. So what do? We wait, he replied calmly. You rebuild. You let them think they've cornered you, and when the moment comes, we hit back. After he left, I sat alone at the table for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me. I realized then that Grandma hadn't just given me land. She'd given me weapons, but rebuilding wasn't glamorous. The first weeks were brutal. The barn roof partially collapsed under old storm damage. Someone clogged the irrigation system with trash. Every day brought a new problem, and I had no idea how to fix most of them. I wasn't a rancher. I was a 22-year-old woman with blistered hands and a stubborn refusal to quit. At night, I studied Grandma's notebooks, pages filled with meticulous notes about crop rotation, livestock, health, weather patterns. Her handwriting was steady, confident. Between the lines were little comments, bits of advice written like she knew I'd be reading them someday. Be patient. The land teaches you if you listen. I talked to her out loud more than once, asked her if she was sure about me, wondered if she'd overestimated my strength. But something shifted as the days passed. I started recognizing patterns, fixing small things, learning through failure. The ranch didn't feel like an enemy anymore. It felt like a challenge, one I was meant to face. And slowly, quietly, I stopped feeling like I was just surviving. I was preparing, because I knew Rick wouldn't stop. And when he came again, I wouldn't be the girl he remembered. Rebuilding didn't feel heroic. It felt lonely, exhausting, and humiliating in ways I hadn't expected. Every morning started with a list of things that needed fixing and ended with only half of them actually done. My hands blistered faster than they healed. My back ached in places I didn't know could hurt. More than once, I sat on the edge of the porch steps at dusk dirt under my nails, fighting the urge to cry, simply because I was so tired of being strong. The ranch tested me constantly. One morning, I found the irrigation lines clogged again, this time deliberately packed with rags and plastic. Another day, a section of fencing collapsed, spooking half the goats into the orchard. I chased them for an hour, heart-pounding boots, slipping in the mud, cursing through tears while they stared at me like I was the problem. I wasn't winning, but I wasn't leaving either. At night, I collapsed into Grandma's armchair and watched videos on tractor maintenance, fence, repair livestock, care, pausing, rewinding, taking notes like my life depended on it. Sometimes I fell asleep with the laptop still glowing in my lap, her old quilt pulled over my shoulders. It was in those quiet hours that I began to notice something. None of this was entirely new. Grandma had taught me more than I realized. She'd shown me how to feel the soil and tell if it was too dry, how to watch the sky for subtle shifts before a storm, how to speak softly to animals that were afraid. Back then it had felt like love. Now it felt like preparation. The first real help came unexpectedly. An older man named Ernie showed up one morning leaning on the fence like he belonged there. He wore suspenders, carried a thermos, and looked at me with knowing eyes. Your grandma used to say you had more backbone than the rest of them combined, he said. Figured I'd see how you were holding up. He helped me fix a corral gate that afternoon, refusing more than a sandwich and coffee in return. Through Ernie, I met others people Rick hadn't managed to poison. Ruth, who'd once done the ranch's bookkeeping, helped me organize accounts. Louise, who ran a small landscaping business, volunteered to help tame the orchard in exchange for firewood. Bit by bit, the ranch began to breathe again. My hands grew tougher. My confidence followed. I started keeping a notebook of my own, just like Grandma's recording what worked, what failed, and which days nearly broke me. Rick didn't disappear. He filed to contest the will. False zoning complaints appeared. During a cold snap, someone cut power to the chicken coop, killing half the flock overnight. That was the night I truly broke. I sat in the hay, cradling a frozen hen, sobbing, until my chest hurt, wondering if Rick was right, if I really wasn't cut out for this. Then I remembered Delaney's words. Let them think they've won. I buried the hens, replaced locks, and started quietly telling my story. I didn't beg, I didn't accuse, I just told the truth. And the town listened. Vendors returned calls. The feed store extended credit. The vet waved a fee and said softly, "Your grandma once saved my clinic. This is nothing." I wasn't invisible anymore, and Rick had no idea how badly things were about to turn. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does in a place like this. It started with small things. A wave at the diner that didn't fade when I walked past. Someone paying for my coffee without saying a word. The feed store putting my name back on their delivery schedule like it had never been removed. Each gesture was quiet, almost cautious, but together they formed something powerful. Momentum. The first real sign came when Ernie convinced me to enter the county fair. Grandma had never missed it. Every fall, she entered the ranch's honey and apples, treating it less like a competition and more like a conversation with the community. I almost didn't go. I told myself it didn't matter that I had bigger problems, but Ernie just looked at me and said, "She'd haunt you if you skipped it." So I went. I brought 2 jars of wildflower honey and a crate of our best apples, set them up on a modest table with a handwritten label, Winter's Ranch. I didn't expect much, but when the judges stopped, they lingered, asked questions, smiled. 2 days later, I won a blue ribbon for the honey. I stood there holding it, my hands shaking, tears burning behind my eyes. Not because of the prize, but because it felt like proof that I hadn't failed her, that her name still meant something. People talked after that. Whispers turned warmer, louder. Elena's really turning that place around. Rick wanted to sell it off. Maybe Grandma knew exactly what she was doing. Rick heard those whispers too. A week later, I got a formal invitation. A family meeting, hosted at Rick's house. The note was short. Let's talk before things go too far. I knew it could be a trap. I knew walking into his territory meant giving him a sense of control. But I also knew this was either his breaking point or his next move. I prepared carefully. Copies of documents, statements, the recording, evidence stacked neatly in a worn folder. I put on my boots, took a deep breath, and drove up the long gravel drive I hadn't touched since I was 17. Rick's house looked exactly the same, polished, staged, impersonal. The door opened before I knocked. Inside, Lorraine watched me like a hawk. Tyler and Brandon sat at the counter, arms crossed, postures defensive. I didn't sit. I wasn't staying long. Rick led me into the dining room and closed the door. "We got off on the wrong foot," he said. I said nothing. He talked about legacy, about family, about how times had changed. I listened until he finally stopped. "Then why did you try to sell it?" I asked quietly. That question broke something in him. Not enough to stop him, but enough to reveal the truth underneath. He called Grandma naive, said she made a mistake. "No," I said, setting the folder down. "You did." When he saw the evidence, the panic finally surfaced. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to stop," I said, "or I stop being polite." I left without waiting for an answer. On the drive home, I knew one thing for certain. Rick wasn't done. So neither was I. That night, I called Delaney. It was time to go public. Going public felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing whether the ground would rise to meet me or disappear completely. That night, after I got back from Rick's house, I didn't sleep. I sat at Grandma's desk, the same one where she used to pay bills and write letters, in that careful cursive, and drafted an open letter to the town. I didn't write it as an accusation. I wrote it as a tribute. I wrote about Grandma Evelyn's love for the land, about how she believed the ranch wasn't something to be owned, but something to be protected. I quoted her will without naming names. I talked about restoring the orchard, about choosing stewardship over profit, about honoring a legacy instead of selling it to the highest bidder. Anyone with half a brain could read between the lines. The local paper ran it on the front page that Sunday. By Monday, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Farmers I'd never met called to offer advice. Nearby co-ops asked about supply partnerships. A woman from the library thanked me for honoring Grandma, her voice cracking as she spoke. Even people who had avoided me weeks earlier now nodded openly, like they'd finally chosen a side. Rick's construction company lost 2 contracts within days. By midweek, his name wasn't being whispered with admiration anymore. It was being followed by raised eyebrows and long pauses. Reputation, I learned, was a fragile thing. Once cracked, it didn't heal easily. I didn't stop there. I reached out to everyone Rick had pushed aside over the years. Grandma's church group, the bakery where she'd volunteered, the high school where she'd read to kids every Thursday afternoon. I didn't ask for favors. I just told the truth. The town responded in ways I never expected. The library hosted a Winter's Ranch Day in Grandma's honor. The feed store put my honey on the counter by the register. People started stopping by the ranch just to say hello, to walk the orchard, to tell me stories about Grandma I'd never heard. For the first time, I wasn't standing alone. I launched a simple website, photos of the land, updates on repair, stories about learning to run a ranch at 22 with more determination than experience. People loved the honesty. They loved watching something grow instead of watching it be stripped down. And Rick, he panicked. Through a mutual contact, I found out he was preparing one last move, a petition to freeze the will, pending a fraud investigation. No evidence, no merit, just enough legal noise to bleed me dry. So I beat him to it. With Delaney's help, I filed an injunction and a civil suit outlining manipulation, sabotage, and fraudulent interference with a lawful estate. We submitted the recordings, the false zoning complaints, forged developer documents, and sworn statements from locals. This wasn't defense anymore. It was offense. The court date was set and the town buzzed. Everyone knew something big was coming. Rick didn't realize how much he'd underestimated Grandma or me. The night before the hearing, Delaney called. "There's one more thing," he said. A third envelope. She instructed me to open it only if they tried to destroy what mattered most. I closed my eyes. Grandma had known this would come, and whatever was inside that envelope was going to end it, one way or another. The morning of the hearing arrived, wrapped in gray clouds, so low it felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. I dressed simply, black button-down jeans, boots, polished cleaner than they'd ever been. Not to impress anyone, but because I wanted to walk into that courthouse as myself, not as a scared girl or a grieving granddaughter. Delaney met me on the courthouse steps, coffee in one hand, leather case in the other. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No drama, no spectacle, just a probate judge, worn wooden benches, and a handful of familiar faces in the gallery. Ruth from the bakery, Ernie in his suspenders. Even the sheriff nodded at me as I took my seat. Rick arrived late, of course. He walked in with a lawyer in an expensive suit, Lorraine trailing behind him like a shadow wearing pearls. Tyler and Brandon didn't come. Delaney presented our case calmly, methodically. The will, the psychiatric evaluation, the sabotage, then the audio recording. When Rick's voice echoed through the courtroom, stripped of charm and dripping with intent, the air shifted. Lorraine went pale. Rick didn't move, but something in his posture cracked. His lawyer tried to recover, claiming undue influence. Delaney stood again. "Your Honor, we have one final document, the third envelope." The judge opened it carefully, read silently at first, then looked up. Eyebrows raised. When he read aloud, Grandma's words filled the room, sharp, precise, devastating. She named Rick directly, called out his greed, his entitlement, and then she did something I never could have imagined. She exposed him. Financial misconduct, fraudulent contractor bills, bank records, signed statements. The judge stopped him mid-sentence. "That's enough." Rick's lawyer withdrew the contest on the spot. The gavel came down. The will stood. Outside, Rick didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just looked tired, defeated. I watched him leave without saying a word. For the first time in my life, he had nothing left to take from me. Stop! Part 9, What She Left Me to Become. When I returned to the ranch after the hearing, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, just settled like a long-held breath finally released. The orchard was beginning to bloom again, pink and white petals drifting through the breeze like confetti. No one had bothered to clean up. The goats followed me across the yard, bumping my legs with familiar impatience, and for once, the sound made me laugh instead of flinch. The legal battle was over. The war Rick tried to start had burned itself out. But what surprised me most was how little victory felt like triumph. There was no rush of adrenaline, no urge to call anyone and celebrate. Instead, there was a quiet certainty settling into my bones. I hadn't won something. I had kept something, and somehow that felt bigger. The town kept showing up. Someone donated replacement chickens. Someone else dropped off lumber without leaving a name. Kids from the local school came by on a field trip, wide-eyed and curious, listening as I explained how honey was harvested and why the orchard mattered. They asked questions Grandma would have loved answering, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice guiding mine. People stopped calling it Evelyn's ranch. They started calling it Elena's. I didn't correct them, not because it wasn't hers, it always would be, but because I finally understood what she'd meant. I wasn't replacing her. I was continuing her. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with Ernie lemonade sweating in our hands as we watched the fields stretch toward the horizon. She'd be proud, he said. I nodded. She'd probably also be furious it took this much chaos. He chuckled. Sounds like her. Inside the house, framed on the living room wall, hung Grandma's final letter. Every morning I passed it on my way to the kitchen. Every morning I read the last line like a promise instead of a warning. If they try to burn this place down, you've got the water. Rick tried. He failed. And in the end, what Grandma left me wasn't just land or proof or protection. She left me myself.